Cale Jaffe. I'm at the law school. Let me introduce, or let them introduce themselves. My fellow panelists, David Sly and Beth Roach. So David, why don't you go first?
Okay. My name is David Sly. I work for a group that's based here in Charlottesville called Wild Virginia. And I also work as a consultant for lots of other groups, especially water groups. And I'm also a former Virginia DEQ employee, and I can tell you a little bit more about that in a little bit.
Hello everyone, my name is Beth Roach and I am grants manager for the James River Association. I'm also a member of the Nottoway Indian Tribe of Virginia. I serve on the council, I'm a storyteller, and manage our environmental initiatives. And recently I was appointed to the Governor's Council on Environmental Justice. Happy to be here.
So I thought I would start with just a couple of questions for the three of us up here, and then very quickly go to your all's questions and try to get a discussion going as best we can. So initially I thought, just so that you know a little bit more about where David, Beth, and I are coming from, just share a little bit about our sort of own experiences, either with situations like the Flint situation or the Charleston, West Virginia, or other environmental justice or Clean Water Act cases. So Beth, do you want to start, and then we'll just go from there?
Sure. So I was born and raised in the Lower James, just downriver from Hopewell. Does anybody know the significance of that? So when I was born, we were still under a fishing ban that lasted for 13 years due to the toxic spill of Keepone, just downriver. So I grew up swimming in that water. That's really where my family is. We're based right there on the Surrey side of Jamestown and Williamsburg. So undoubtedly that had a huge impression on me growing up. And in my professional life, I've served as, I was employed by DCR, Department of Conservation and Recreation, for 7 years and worked as a park ranger. And so really got into more of the human element of what is land resource and what does water mean to all of us. And I guess, are we doing the moment in time when we were?
Sure, yes, yeah, something that you've, not the lessons learned. We'll save lessons learned for a second piece.
The moment in time.
Yeah.
So I was working for DCR for 7 years. I left and did some work in exhibit design and some other nonprofit work, but April 30th, 2014, a crude oil train derailed in Lynchburg and burst open, flames, caught the river on fire. I was down the Outer Banks having a great time. I was working for a nonprofit down there, and I remember getting the email from Pat Calvert, who was Upper James River keeper at the time. I was a river rat, so trained. Is anybody a river rat in here? Yeah, I knew there was at least one. Awesome. Those are like our dedicated core volunteers, and so you get updates about all sorts of things. And I just remember sitting at my desk and just feeling this just god-awful sinking in my stomach, and I just thought, no way, no, not our river. I mean, if you know anything about the James River now, you know that it is one of the most resilient rivers in the state, in the nation. In the 70s, the Keepone, it was just terribly degraded. So at that point, I thought, okay, it's time for me to come home. And 3 months later, I was working for the James River Association back in Richmond, and I've been there for the past 4 years, and it was able to immediately start working on the Our River at Risk campaign, which I can talk a little bit more later. But that campaign was in response directly to the crude oil train, but also that happened, the crude oil train happened just several months after Elk River, and right around the same time the coal ash spill into the Dan River. So with all those things in mind, JRA did something a little bit more progressive than what we're used to, and we worked a lot with SELC and still do, and so happy to be here and kind of just reinforced why it's important to do the work that we do.
As Beth alluded to, mentioned SELC. So before I joined the faculty at the law school, I was an attorney with the Southern Environmental Law Center here in Charlottesville, and worked for SELC for 12 and a half years. Just in terms of sort of the experience that I'm bringing to this, similar cases, I got to work on a variety of matters at SCLC, not a huge number of water cases, a big Clean Air Act case against Duke Energy that went to the Supreme Court. Worked a lot on the uranium mining issue, which is still very much a live issue. Actually, that case is now, there's a petition from the mining company before the Supreme Court of the United States. So the uranium mining issue is definitely still a potent issue here in Virginia. And I've worked on, now that I've moved over into the law school, right now I'm working on a Clean Water Act case where the Environmental Law Clinic at UVA, it's a practicing clinic where students get to work with me and with real clients on matters. So we're right now representing the Virginia chapter of the Sierra Club in a case involving destruction or threatened destruction of wetlands down in Poquoson, Virginia, which is down in the Hampton Roads area. That case is set actually for an oral argument in Richmond on May 3rd. And before I go over to David, one sort of story that I just wanted to share, one thought. One of the things I've been that I wanted to work on at the law school that I've been working on is the political polarization issue, and it came up a little bit in the film, and how I think about climate issues, but really environmental issues generally, become so politically polarized. And what's really interesting about the Flint River crisis, the Flint water crisis rather, is that you had this problem where EPA, and in trying to manage the lead and copper rule, which is the regulation at issue there, was in a situation where the cleanup was going to be beyond what any budget could reasonably cover. And so they were sort of stymied with this, we can't admit what's going on here because that will trigger these cleanups that no one can afford. And that was sort of the problem at EPA. And there were politically two reactions to that. On the left was, well, if that's the problem, then it's proof that we need to be funding these environmental and regulatory agencies and these environmental health protection agencies more robustly if they don't have the money to do the jobs that we've tasked them to do. On the right, and you heard this at the end of the film, it was the opposite. Well, if EPA is so corrupt, this is a government-created problem. The solution is abolish EPA. They're the problem. And so in that sense, I think we have to think very carefully and very strategically about what do we do when we find these kinds of problems that Mark Edwards from Virginia Tech was uncovering. You know, how do we talk about those, and what do we move forward as next steps? So that's sort of the perspective I'm bringing in.
Okay. My story is so long and sordid that it's hard to know where to go, but I started as an environmental professional in 1980 when I went to work as a summer employee for what's now the Virginia DEQ, the Department of Environmental Quality. I worked there 2 summers in a row, and then I got a full-time job there, and essentially I never left for about 15 years. I moved up to the position of senior engineer, working on water quality issues and water pollution permitting. And I tell people I had an experience that I don't think many government regulatory employees ever have, and that is the bosses that I had early in my career actually didn't allow me to get by with not answering hard questions, and didn't allow me to get by with, I'm doing it this way because that's what the manual says or that's what they did last time. They wanted to know the real reason why it should be done that way or not done that way. And that was rare, but I certainly enjoyed it, took advantage of it, and thrived as a bureaucrat because I was allowed to make things better. I realized things didn't move quickly, but I was allowed to ask all the right questions and to try to find the right answers and to enact solutions when I could find them. But things started going bad in the mid-90s, early to mid-90s. And I remember very clearly, this is an indelible image in my mind. The day that one of my bosses walked into my office and said, okay, we're supposed to analyze how these discharges on one part of a river will affect the water supply intake many miles downstream. And here's the result I want you to get. You know, and I mean, I'll never forget his face when he told me that. I'll never forget how I had no clue what to say. And of course, I wrote my memo, I did my calculations, I wrote my memo and came back and said, you cannot meet the standards down there. You will be endangering the people who use that water, and that's not acceptable. And that started me on about a 1.5-year long battle to try to both keep my job and tell the truth. And I ended up resigning in protest over what was happening at DEQ. So, and then I decided to go to law school so I could come back and sue the bastards. and so since then I have spent the last 20 some years working in states all across the Southeast US, both as a technical person, as an attorney, to show what agencies do wrong, what they do dishonestly, and how they should do things correctly. And so I wish I could say I was surprised at anything I saw up there, but I just can't.
Wow. Well, so I was going to ask the panel sort of to share lessons learned, but I'm thinking now, I'll save that as our final question. So Beth and David, that's our final question will be that. And turn now to any sort of comments or thoughts you all had, either on the film or for us generally.
What is Wild Virginia?
We are a group that our primary mission through time has been to protect your national forest in Virginia, which is about 1.8 million acres of amazing resources. We actually have edged out a little bit and we work in places that are outside the national forest, but essentially our mission is to preserve, protect, and improve the natural places of Western Virginia that we all care about and rely upon. Thank
Is it
you.
a private organization?
It is a nonprofit organization. You can look us up on the web. And if you're a Virginian, you need to be a wild Virginian.
Yeah, right here.
All right, everybody knows that putting fluoride in the water is bad. There is no benefit in putting a hazardous waste into drinking water. So what is the policy? I mean, I know in Virginia, 90% of municipal water adds fluoride to it. So how's that going to change?
Is it going to change?
So I'm not an expert in fluoride. I know there's well, I'll start with you all if you know anything about fluoride. I mean, I'll say this, that my limited understanding
Wait,
is,
excuse me.
yeah.
You don't have to go into any science.
Yeah.
It's a hazardous waste from industry. And because it becomes a product when they sell it, then it doesn't have to meet the hazardous waste protocol. So it's selling it to cities, so it's a product. But it's a hazardous waste. So you don't even have to look at the studies to know that's a bad idea.
Well, I guess I would push back a little bit and say I do want to look at the studies. I mean,
Well,
one of the things that and this comes up on a host of issues that whether it's fluoride issue, whether it's any of the sort of the controversial environmental issues from climate change to vaccines to whatever it is as much as parts of that documentary made you uncomfortable or doubt, lose trust in our government agencies, the one piece that it didn't really attack is the concept of transparent peer-reviewed science. So I'm on the faculty of the law school. My wife is on the faculty of the medical school. When I go to bed at night, I get to read a book of whatever I want. She has this massive stack of peer-reviewed medical journals that whenever she's done with her patient work, she's just constantly studying. So my sense with those sort of hard scientific questions or hard medical questions is, you know, I'm not the expert in it. She's the one who spends all the time with these peer-reviewed journals. I'm going to trust her on those issues. So like a question on, this is getting a bit of a tangent, but let's say a question if someone in our family were, God forbid, were diagnosed with cancer. I know I could go online, I could find a lot of resources that tells me what to do about chemotherapy or not do about chemotherapy. But rather than, I'm not going to do that search because I'm not the expert in it. I'm going to trust the person who's been going through the peer-reviewed science on it. So I guess my takeaway on the issue generally is one of transparency and robust investment in the peer review process.
Well, I would go off of that and say that in a general sense, in a wider sense, what I learned, as I said early on, is that sometimes you have hard questions, like the one you just answered. And I'll admit, I don't know a lot about fluoride. I've usually looked at what's coming out the other end of the pipe, going into streams, and to stop that. So I don't know as much about drinking water, but the key is that there are hard questions that people in power don't want to answer. And we have to keep asking those questions. You saw the doctor there, who at first was all about transparency and seemed very open and very honest. And then later on, I saw his eyes getting, evasive. And he didn't want to answer those questions because the answers were going to be inconvenient for his job, for his position. And so that, without being able to answer, too much specifically about fluoride, that's one of the answers. Now, you take peer-reviewed science, you take what evidence you have, and you continue to put it in their face, whoever it is you're trying to get answers from, and you continue to insist on them. I'm not going to tell you there's a quick answer, because again, I've been working on this stuff since 1980, and I've had a lot more defeats than victories. But I think that's one of the keys. And then the other key is that we do need to protect people within these agencies who are telling the truth. That means whistleblower laws. It means support for those folks any way that we as citizens can help support and defend them.
Yeah. And just a little bit to add to that, is it going to change? That's a really great question because there's so many threats all over the place. I think that if we look at any realm of our climate and our environment, we could really be overwhelmed with how daunting it all seems, right? I think one thing I would add is taking peer-reviewed science, taking the data, taking all that scientific stuff, which is really tough to distill. I mean, they did a great job in the documentary, but y'all saw it took months and years for them to get to that point. And so when the water started to smell fine, people kind of forgot about it, right? But it shows that still there were things to be worried about. So I think one thing for all of us to think about in this room, and y'all are a great audience because you're here, it's to combine the human stories along with the science and to keep that issue at the forefront. So your stories are all important. The fact that you asked that question is a story in itself, and I'm sure you've got, some personal things to tie to it, and we all do. So I would say, in addition to all of the protections that we're talking about up here, I want to also just empower all of us in here to use our voices and to stay diligent and keep pressure on.
Can I add just one more thing that came to mind when you were saying that? There are a lot of really technical questions that you have to dig into studies and you have to try to figure out what they all mean. And if you're not an expert, it's almost impossible to sort through them. But the fact is that some of these agencies have been giving us answers for decades that don't require a whole lot of expertise. For example, state of West Virginia, Kentucky, Virginia have been allowing people to blow to the tops off mountains and throw them in the valley for years and years and told us that that was okay because water quality was protected. When you have examples like that that are so clearly ridiculous, then that should spur you to realize that if something that should be self-evident, you're not getting the truth on, that when they're really technical things, you got a really hard road to get that figured out. But again, my big thing is ask hard questions. And there are people that you can ask that question to and put them on the spot.
I just want
Well, I want to come back, but let's go to John.
I'm actually going to follow up on this. I did research this a while ago, the idea of the fluoride, and actually the Sierra Club, our local group, has re-encouraged that fluoride be removed from the water. It's being added purposely right now by Urbana Water and Sewer Authority, and they're basing a lot of that on some research. A lot of it comes from recommendations of the American Dental Association is the big one. But many communities are no longer putting fluoride in the water. Portland, Oregon, I mean, there are lots of them in the United States, and if you look in the European Union, I believe almost every country in Europe does not add fluoride to the water. And there are many scientific organizations that are saying that fluoride is harmful to human health and that it causes something called fluorosis and doesn't really help your teeth in the long run. And it can have some bad effects on your bone structure. But I'm not an expert on this either. But if you want to get rid of the fluoride, all you have to do is get your government, your local government, to stop adding it. I mean, a month ago, we had the head of the Urbana Water and Sewer Authority here doing a program. He did an excellent job, by the way. He was a real nice guy. Somebody did ask him about the fluoride. And, he's putting it in because our local government has said, that's what we're going to do. They started putting it in, I think, in the 1950s, and they have continued doing that since then. But they can stop. It's just a matter of the people putting the pressure on them, just like they were going to add chloramines to our water about 5 or 6 years ago, and we filled up the county office building. and all of a sudden, the government officials changed their position on it. So, it's just a matter of getting together and organizing and getting the elected government officials to do the right thing.
So, yeah, I think I'll do I'm looking to time. I think I've got one more question and then a wrap up. We're ending at 7, is that right? All right, or whatever, yeah.
I was just going to ask, are there other industrialized countries that have a much better safety record, and why couldn't we then?
So,
What countries?
who are the leaders internationally? That's a great question. I don't know the answer. I know that part of the problem, it was hinted at here, there was a reference to 80,000 chemicals in use. That goes back to the TSCA, the Toxic Substances Control Act, which had a whole process when it was initially passed to test for and document the safety of all sorts of synthetic chemicals that might be used from everything from making clothing to food preservatives to what have you. And the process became so intensely litigated and so cumbersome that I don't know the number off the top of my head, but it's less than 10, the number of chemicals that actually made it all the way through that process to be approved the way the law was initially intended to be used. And the number of chemicals that get allowed for use but not tested for use is more than 80,000. So that the law was, widely seen as a failure. There was a toxic substances reform that was passed in 2016. President Obama signed it into law. The implementation of that new law of course, has now fallen to the Trump administration. So what happens with those reforms, whether they were strong enough to begin with, whether they are effectively implemented, all of that remains to be seen. Do you all have any other thoughts on that and sort of our best practices we should?
Well, just that I think you've been getting at it with some of this other discussion, and that is that we shouldn't have to justify why something should stay out of our water, especially things that we can't pronounce and can't understand where it came from. Somebody else should have to explain why it should be put in our water or why it should be allowed to stay in our water. The process has been turned on its head. And I'll just say that when you hear anybody say, any scientist or person who claims to be a scientist, I know this is safe, then they're lying to you, because that's not the way scientists, that's not the way doctors talk to you. They say, well, you know, there's a risk here, and maybe I can give you this estimate of what your risks are if you do this versus this. That's what science does. Usually when people tell you something is safe, it's just like that. It's because they haven't looked close enough and they haven't proven that it's not safe. They haven't proven that people are getting sick or dying because of it. So I'm not sure if that helps, but that's just coming from the other end of the question. It's why should it be there, not why should I have to fight to get it out?
So I'm happy to stick around for a little bit, and I don't know if Dave and Beth are as well. But before we end the formal part of it, I thought any lessons learned from your experience as an advocate, as a government official, someone who's gotten to see this movie that you wanted to sort of share.
Sure. I can tell you that with my work and what drives me, it comes from my personal story. It comes from swimming in river water that was dirty, and having my grandfather die at an early age. And he was an avid fisher of subsistence from the river. And so when I think about why I do what I do and why I speak up, it's because of my personal story. And I would really encourage every one of you to think about your own personal story and what it is that compels you to come here tonight and to care about these issues. And that's what's going to help drive this data, the law, the policy. It's packing out those rooms, it's writing letters, it's doing any kind of communication that I think you can to get through to these folks. It's really all about the humans in this, because we can fight capitalism and yell about it, be so mad about it, and we can just shout about it from the rooftops, but industry moves much faster than regulations move, and so we really have to maintain our stories at the forefront. So if I could just say anything, it would be just know your own personal story. Don't be afraid to stand up. I mean, we saw Erin Brockovich up there, right? I mean, she had her personal story, and who was she? So I think we all have a right to stand up and say, that's what we need to.
Dave?
Well, I think I've already preached a little bit about one of the things I've learned through time, and that is when people don't want to answer your questions, keep asking them, because there's a reason they don't want to answer. Insist on not just surface answers, but real answers. The other thing that I would say is that when I was growing up and I started figuring out about environmental problems and all kinds of other problems, civil rights and justice issues, I was pissed off for a long time about a lot of stuff. And finally I realized that I needed to narrow down.